September 1st, 11:18 a.m. I arrived at the Rook Island Lighthouse this morning. The helicopter flight from the mainland was a jarring and bumpy 45-minute flight over open ocean. I've never been on a helicopter before, and I'm not sure what I was expecting, but the sea winds were pushing us around pretty good on the way over. Ammond, the pilot, told me twice during the trip that we might have to abort and try again when the weather was calmer. But he kept us moving, and eventually we arrived at my destination. He'd been pretty talkative when we first met, and even more so when we lifted off from the helipad at the port. But that seemed to fade the closer we got to Rook Island. He'd filled me in on the little of the history of the place to pass the time. How the current lighthouse was actually the second one to stand on that rocky outcropping. According to him, the first had been built sometime in the early 1700s and had been completely wiped out by a nasty winter storm in 1803, taking all 3 men stationed there with it. Another, more modern design had been erected after that, which was the foundation of the current Rook Island Lighthouse. He'd also made some brief mentions of how even that original lighthouse had been built upon the foundations of some old, secluded abbey. But the weather started getting rougher by then, and he was focused more on flying the helicopter than chatting. I wasn't too sure what he was telling me, honestly. Sure, I could buy that there had been another lighthouse before this one. But an abbey? Out here? Nah, I call bullshit. I was pretty sure he was jerking my chain. Unfortunately, I didn't have the chance to probe any further after that, because the lighthouse appeared before us at that point, a little dot of white emerging from the haze of rain and mist in the otherwise endless ocean below. How the hell do they even build lighthouses way out here in the middle of nowhere? The winds had been pushing us around even more forcefully as we approached, but Ammon was able to land us on the small helipad that had been retrofitted to the lighthouse roof with only a bit of struggle. He tried to maintain his ever-present calm demeanor, but I didn't miss the beads of sweat and the occasional grimaces of concentration as we settled on the pad. Even after we'd touched down, he seemed on edge. His eyes never stopped moving, and he never took his hands from the controls. Just gave me a nod after we'd settled on the deck, my signal to get moving. I hopped out, grabbed my bags, and climbed down through the trapdoor of the helipad, ducking under the rotor wash and careful of my footing on the rain-slick surface. As soon as I was safely below, he was up and gone again, the bright orange and yellow helicopter fading into the gray sky as it made its way back to land. The lighthouse isn't what I expected. I was envisioning a quaint little island, maybe covered in green grass and with a cozy old cottage standing nearby. Typical postcard stuff. Rook Island isn't that sort of lighthouse. It rises like some pale skeletal finger from the depths, jutting out from the angry sea atop a narrow pillar of rock. From the air, I could see the dark shadow of the submerged shoal surrounding it, an underwater island that couldn't quite reach the surface. Beyond the jagged edges of the shoal, the water turned indigo and then black as it fell away to thousands of feet of murky depth. The lighthouse was a slender tower built atop that rocky outcropping, battered and scarred from 200 years of dutiful service and countless repairs. Ammon told me that before they had built the helipad on the roof, lighthouse keepers arrived on boats at a small dock, the ruins of which were still visible at the base of the rocks. A narrow and precarious staircase, long since taken by the seas, had been the only means of entrance or escape from the island at that time. There were only small and infrequent windows of opportunity to safely approach the island by boat, and it wasn't uncommon for the storms to make that approach impossible for weeks on end. According to the pilot, more than one keeper had lost their lives to the churning waters here over the years. Bodies never found. I guess when the sea takes a man, it's not too keen on giving him back. Things were different now, of course. The lighthouse had been automated back in the 90s, and now the only people that came out here were the small crews that visited a few times a year to perform maintenance. That's us. Well, Technically, it's only me right now. My partner, Calvin Sykes, missed his connecting flight yesterday and won't be here until tomorrow. So here I am, watching the helicopter disappear into the distance as I stand on the widow's walk around the lamp room, with only the sounds of the wind and crashing of the waves against the rocks below me. For all that noise, why does it seem so quiet? My first job with this company, my first time in a lighthouse at all, and I'm all by myself in the middle of the ocean, no land in sight. You know, I don't think I've ever felt so alone. September 2nd, 9:30 a.m. What a shitty night. As it turns out, the weather only got worse when the sun went down yesterday. The gray clouds turned to black, and the rain came down so heavily that I could actually feel the vibrations from it in the wooden floor of the sleeping quarters. The wind didn't help. It battered against the windows and churned up the water below into violent whitecaps and huge swells crashing over the island. The howling was more than a little unnerving, but I kept telling myself it was just the way the gale moved around the rocks in the tower. I tried not to think of what it would have been like for those men who had been swept away by the seas all those years ago. I can't imagine a more terrifying way to go out. Needless to say, I didn't get much sleep. For the first time in recent memory, my night was filled with disturbing dreams. I can't remember them this morning, but I woke with an unsettled stomach and a constant feeling of anxiousness. I thought it best to avoid coffee and instead settled for a granola bar and some water. There's a chair and a small desk up in the lamp room, so I'm sitting up here right now watching out over the water and listening to the quiet hum of the mechanism behind me as it slowly rotates the beacon. The storm passed sometime in the night, but the sun is still blocked out by heavy cloud cover, and the white caps of the ocean make me think it may get worse before it clears. Calvin should be here this afternoon, so I'm sure I'll be more at ease once he arrives and we start our work. According to company safety rules, there has to be at least 2 people present before I can do anything here, so I'm just trying to relax until he gets here. By this time next week, I'll be on a flight back home. September 2nd, 12:30 p.m. Well, that's just great. Just got word over the radio that the weather back at the port has gotten worse. Low visibility, heavy wind and rain, and thunder and lightning. No flights today, and maybe not tomorrow either. I talked to Calvin a little over the radio. He sounded a little frustrated and told me that there'd been a screw-up, some sort of miscommunication. Apparently, I wasn't supposed to be out here by myself. Company safety policy was pretty clear on that part. I should have waited for him. He assured me it wasn't my fault and I wasn't in any sort of trouble. Someone else just should have known better. In the end, there wasn't anything to do about it now, and he told me to just sit tight and enjoy the scenery. He made a point of reinforcing the safety rules that I should keep to the upper levels until he arrives. That it isn't safe for one person to go sightseeing in the lower levels all alone. There was too much risk of injury in this old tower. That's fine with me, I told him. The view up in the lamp room is pretty good. I'm not happy about it, but I'm still getting paid whether I'm changing bulbs, repainting railings, cleaning bird shit off the stairs, or sitting on my butt. So at least that's something. I brought a book and have some movies on my tablet, so I'm sure I can keep myself entertained. Hopefully the weather will break and Calvin will be here tomorrow. September 2nd, 6:42 p.m. I did some exploring of the lighthouse today, despite Calvin's warnings. I figure he was just making sure he was covering the company's ass if I slip and break an ankle, but what he doesn't know won't hurt him. And truth be told, I'm getting bored. Most of the upper floors are cramped and crowded with equipment. The battery room is barely large enough for a man to squeeze between the banks of cells, and the kitchen/sitting room feels claustrophobic. There's an old TV and DVD player hanging above the refrigerator. It looks like it hasn't been used in 20 years. It's not like I brought any DVDs with me anyway. The sleeping quarters are below that, with 6 compact bunks built against the cylindrical walls of the lighthouse. They have a curve to them, but they're just large enough that you can sleep in them comfortably. Since I'm the only one here, I don't have to fight anyone to get a bottom bunk, so that's nice. The lower floors are larger, since the conical shape of the tower expands outward down towards its base. But even there, the generators and electrical equipment take up most of the free space. There's just not a whole lot of room to spread out in here. Even the bathroom on the floor below the bunk room is tiny, just a toilet and a narrow shower stall and some storage cabinets. On the ground floor, just below the generator room, there's an old, rust-speckled iron door leading outside the lighthouse. This must be where the old keepers used to come through. It's barred and locked from the inside, but I was able to get it open and step out onto the narrow steel landing at the head of the now missing staircase. Twisted railings and 2 heavily corroded steps are all that remain of the stairs. And when I worked up the nerve to creep closer to the edge, I found myself staring down 100 feet of jagged and slick rocks to the pounding black seas below. I couldn't imagine having to brave the steps that had once been there, especially with the gusting wind that was trying its damnedest to peel me off the platform. Even with a firm grip on the doorframe, I didn't feel comfortable staying out there long. Quickly went back inside, replacing the bars and locking the door when I went. A spiral staircase descended even lower than this floor, and I figured it probably led to either a cistern or more fuel storage. I decided to save that for later. My clothes were soaked through now, thanks to the rain and the sea spray, and I was shivering for my brief excursion outside. I decided to head back upstairs, change into some warm clothes, and heat myself up some freeze-dried dinner. Maybe watch a movie on my tablet, sip a glass of the whiskey I'd smuggled along. I'll record more later. September 3rd, 8:25 a.m. Okay, so apparently I was more tired than I thought yesterday. After I ate dinner, which was surprisingly good for freeze-dried beef stroganoff, I went to my bunk with my tablet and, well, honestly, don't remember anything after that. The next thing I do remember was waking up in the middle of the night to another storm that had blown in. Big surprise there. It's funny, but even after only a couple of days here, I'm starting to get used to the creaking and groaning sounds the lighthouse makes in bad weather. At some level, it almost seems familiar and comforting. My tablet had slipped off my chest and found its way to the floor at some point, so I sat up and placed it on the nearby table. I was getting ready to lay back down and get back to sleep when an out-of-place sound wound its way up from somewhere downstairs. It was a low groaning sound, almost a vibration, with a higher-pitched squeal riding just below the surface. It sounded a lot like rusty hinges, and I wondered if I'd neglected to secure the external door when I came back in earlier in the day. Begrudgingly, I slipped on my shoes and grabbed my flashlight and went downstairs. I didn't want to turn on the lights for fear of chasing away any chance I might have to get back to sleep afterwards. I knew if the door had blown open, the storm would find its way in and soak everything. For my first job with the company, I sure as hell didn't want to be responsible for flooding the lower levels, so I figured I needed to check it out and make sure everything was good. I'm not going to lie, going down those curving metal stairs with only my flashlight to guide me in the middle of a storm and surrounded by an angry sea was more than a little unnerving. I thought briefly about how the first lighthouse had been completely destroyed by a winter storm, but pushed that thought from my head and focused on my footing. Now, I'm not a skittish person by nature. I've done plenty of jobs that found me all alone in remote places, and I've never once worried about anything other than whether or not I was able to get the job done on schedule or what I was going to eat for dinner. I pride myself on being rational. I'm not afraid of things that go bump in the night. After all, there's nothing there in the dark that isn't there in the light. But even so, I could feel that growing sense of anxiousness trying to find root in the back of my mind. It was like an unfamiliar whisper telling me to go back up and get back into my bunk. Nothing to see here, move along. So down I went, stubborn as ever. Even before reaching the door, I knew it couldn't have been open. The creaking sound didn't reoccur, and the howl of the wind was still thankfully a muted roar, insulated by the thick walls of the lighthouse. Still, I had come this far, and I knew I wouldn't be able to get back to sleep unless I put eyes on it and checked it for myself. Sure enough, the door was still barred and locked, vibrating and occasionally rattling against its frame from the fury of the wind outside. Giving it a final once-over to reassure myself that all was well, I turned to head back upstairs. No idea what that sound was, but regardless, at least it wasn't anything I did. I'm not supposed to be down there by myself, and I'm not looking to get fired on my first outing with this company for flooding the lighthouse. That was last night. This morning, I've already had my first coffee and some toast, and I'm sitting at the table in the lamp room right now, looking out over the ocean. The storm has lessened in the hours since last night, but it's still raining and blowing outside, and the clouds are still low and gray. I'm no meteorologist, but I'm fairly confident I won't be meeting my partner today either. Starting to wonder if this job was a good idea. I feel like I'm a million miles away from home. Anyway, I'm going to finish another cup of coffee and head on downstairs to poke around a bit more. It'll do me some good to have something to do. More to come. It's 9:45 a.m. Same day. I don't understand. I just... This can't be real. I mean, I must be losing my mind. That's the only explanation, right? Shit. I can't do this right now. September 3rd, 11 a.m. Okay. I've had a couple of glasses of whiskey and I've calmed down a bit. Enough to do this recording of what happened anyway. My thoughts are fragmented, but I'll try my best to make sense of it for anyone who's listening to these recordings. I'll try to just start from the beginning and take it one step at a time. After I finished my coffee, I went downstairs, like I said, turning my attention to the concrete steps that descended further down from the ground level and continuing my exploration from yesterday. As I suspected, the floor below, what you'd call the basement level, I guess, was occupied by a large fuel tank. But what I didn't expect was to find another door and more steps leading even further downward. This was different than I'd seen before, though. It wasn't painted wood or even a solid metal door like the exterior entrance had been, but instead was a wrought iron gate, ornately fashioned and looking more like it belonged in a castle dungeon or something. The center of it was embellished with a large iron crucifix, covering half the gate. I can't say why, but for some reason I found it strangely, foreboding is the word, I guess. The gate had actually been half hidden by some old cargo netting hanging on the wall of the basement level, and I hadn't noticed it at first. I pulled the netting away and took a closer look. Through the iron bars, the beam of my flashlight illuminated rough steps carved into the gray rock of the island itself. They spiraled downward and out of sight, so I couldn't see very far, but my light reflected from the moisture-slick walls and surfaces of the steps. Standing in front of the door, I could smell the cool, musty air that wafted up from somewhere below. It smelled old and stale, like a museum or a stuffy library basement. It was the odor of things hidden away and forgotten. I wondered exactly what reason anyone might have had to dig deeper into the heart of the island, and how far down the stairwell might actually go. There was no key in the lock, but when I tugged on the door, it swung outward with a little resistance, and my stomach lurched the all-too-familiar groaning and screeching that rose from its rusted hinges. There was no mistaking that sound. It was the same as I'd heard last night. I told myself that it had just been the door swinging lightly back and forth, pushed around by the pressure changes caused by the storm. Sounded good at the time. With more apprehension than I'm comfortable admitting, I forced myself to investigate further, carefully making my way down this new stairwell. The steps were slick with moisture and a greenish-black mold that covered most of their surface. They were uneven and steep, clearly carved by an inexpert hand and looking much older than the rest of the lighthouse. The centers of them were worn and smoothed as if by hundreds of years and countless footsteps. As I went, the air grew colder and more humid, and after a bit I had descended far enough that I was sure I must have been below sea level. The walls were hewn with the same rough construction as the steps, and the arched ceiling was barely tall enough to allow me to pass without stooping. Although I didn't keep track, it was at least 10 or 15 minutes that I went down in that spiral tunnel, growing more uncomfortable with each step. The stairwell was so out of place with the more modern construction above that I was sure it must have predated the lighthouse by some time. Maybe it was part of the original lighthouse, I'd thought. Hell, maybe even from that unlikely abbey that the pilot had mentioned. When the stairwell finally reached the bottom, I felt like I had gone 100 feet or more below the surface of the rocky island, and the thought of being surrounded by all that black ocean made me feel more than a little uncomfortable. Down here, I could feel the vibrations of the seas as they battered against the stones outside, could hear the muted thunder of their crashing in deep echoes. The room I found myself in was larger than I might have expected, probably 50 feet across. In the center of that stone room was a small wooden table and chair, both made from heavy dark wood and obviously old. An antique oil lamp sat atop the damp surface of the table, its glass shield soot-stained around the top and encrusted with long-dried remains of its fuel. In the center of the table, a thick, leather-bound book lay open, though the years and moisture had turned the pages to little more than a mass of black and decay, making it impossible to identify what it might have been. A Bible, maybe? I'm not sure. I swung the flashlight in the area around the table and found it otherwise empty of furniture, but not of decoration. The walls were smoother than those of the stairwell I'd come through, and though heavily stained with streaks and blotches of mildew and mold, I could see the time-faded remains of pastel murals covering them. I can't say why, but an uneasy feeling had settled over me, almost as if I'd found a place I wasn't supposed to, like I was trespassing somewhere I wasn't welcome. Pushing it aside, I wandered a little closer to the walls, examining more closely the artwork and trying to discern what it depicted. The scenes were so corrupted by the wet environment that I couldn't make out any details, but the whole thing had the feel of those elaborate frescoes I had seen in old churches. Turning away from the paintings, I swept my light over the whole of the room again, the bright beam cutting a narrow tunnel through the gloom, tiny motes and moisture sparkling in the light. My breath hitched and my heart jumped to my throat when it suddenly found the two motionless forms kneeling upon the floor and facing a section of the wall. I let out a spontaneous curse at the sight, shocked to find I wasn't alone in this dark place. Instinctively, I leapt back, keeping the flashlight trained on those huddled forms. I stood rooted to that spot a long while, the beam from my light shaking in my hand and my feet ready to take flight at any second. When some time had passed without anything happening, I finally worked up the courage to move a little closer. What I saw only added to my confusion. What knelt before me were the skeletal remains of two nuns, their old-fashioned habits hanging loosely upon their still erect frames. Their fleshless skulls were slightly downturned, as if they died in prayer, and the bleached bones of their hands still clutched what appeared to be rosaries and crucifixes. The fabric and the design of their vestments, though plain and coarse, marked them as Catholic nuns, or of some related sect. At least that was my guess. It was obvious they'd been here for a long time, maybe centuries, dying where they knelt in eternal watch. I couldn't understand why they hadn't crumbled to piles of bone and cloth in all that time, and my mind continued to rebel against my presence here. Every ounce of my body felt that pull, the insistence that I leave this place immediately and never return. Still, I focused on my breathing and forced my thoughts to calm, turning the whole thing over with logical set. Yes, there were bodies, but they were old. It wasn't like I'd just tripped across a murder scene. If this place had once been a hermitage convent or abbey, it only made sense that there might be some remnants of their existence. I told myself that this was a holy place, a place where the pious sequestered themselves from the rest of humanity to focus their devotions without worldly distractions. If anything, this was a historical place that should be studied by scholars, not a place of irrational fear. I told myself all this, and it helped a little. Enough for my curiosity to take the lead once again and my racing heart to ease a bit. Reluctantly turning my light from the two sisters, I focused it on the section of wall before them, where their attentions had been focused in their vigil. It was there I spied the door. It was cleverly concealed under the decorations of the mural, but the thick wood had swollen and warped with the moisture and now stood a little proud of the wall. It looked like there had once been a handle of some sort to pull it open, but now there was only a hole where it had once been mounted. I pulled at it tentatively before I realized that there were heavy black iron nails running around the corner of the rotting wood and into the frame. I can't say why, but I felt compelled to investigate further. This had obviously been the subject of the nuns' attentions, and had been important enough for them to remain in prayer until their dying breaths. I couldn't imagine what might lay beyond that door. I grabbed the multi-tool from my back pocket and flipped open the pliers, going to work pulling the nails out one at a time, and letting them drop with dull rings to the floor. When I was done, I stepped back a moment and looked over the surface, making sure I hadn't missed any. I hesitated a beat, something almost instinctual, a primitive stirring at the back of my mind, telling me to leave it alone. Ignoring that voice, I carefully hooked a finger through the hole in the door and pulled, abruptly jerking my hand away at the slimy, spongy feel of the wood. It felt uncomfortably warm and somehow sickly, almost like I had touched something alive. I grimaced and scrubbed my hand against my jeans in revulsion. The door swung open slowly with a scraping protest until there was enough room for me to step inside. When I did, a soft current of fetid air blew past me, smelling of stagnation and age and something else that I couldn't place. Something wrong. This is where I begin to wonder if I've lost my grip on sanity. The interior of this room was undecorated, the walls the same slimy gray as the stairwell had been. But it was what my flashlight revealed within that demanded my immediate attention. There, chained to the far wall with thick iron shackles, stood the desiccated and unmistakable remains of a man. He had been huge, every bit of 7 feet tall and grotesquely deformed, even though the flesh had long since shrunk and withered, taking on a gray hue mottled with angry red splotches. I could see clearly the unnatural protrusions covering the whole of his remains, pushing out from beneath the leathery skin as if they were trying to escape. The skeleton beneath was twisted and malformed. Across the wall behind the figure, it looked like someone had painted huge outstretched wings in a powdery black medium, charcoal or something like that. It almost looked burned into the surface of the stone wall, like someone had painted it with gunpowder and then ignited it. Those wings must have been 12 feet across and depicted in a fashion that made me think of something reptilian or maybe bat-like, with membranes of skin instead of feathers. It gave the whole scene an even more sinister and unsettling air. I'm not sure how, but the corpse still stood upright as it had in life, with arms outstretched and bound by the heavy iron restraints. Its head, abnormally large and bulbous, hung upon its chest limply, its features downcast and hidden from view. How long had this man suffered here before his death? What terrible thing had he done to deserve this? What was this place? Before I had time to contemplate this any further, something happened that I still can't explain, and is the reason my hands are still shaking right now. It moved. The fucking thing actually moved. With the rustling and creaking sound of dried leather stretched taut, the head lifted slowly from its chest, and black pits that once held eyes fixed on me. A wave of nausea swept over me like a cold wash, and I started hyperventilating. Intense flashes of sickening revulsion and raw fear spiked painfully in my mind for a blinding moment, like nothing I've ever felt before. I put my hands to my head as if that would help ward off this onslaught of pain, but it didn't shield me at all. Stumbling backwards blindly, I tripped and fell hard in the doorway, cutting my hand painfully on the discarded iron nails and scattering them across the floor. I was only there for a second, though, because the next thing I knew, I'd scrambled to my feet and was running back up the winding staircase as fast as I could, hands against the disgusting slickness of the mold and algae to steady my flight. All I could hear was the thudding of my heartbeat in my temples and the rasping of my breath. When I reached the iron gate, I rushed through and slammed it hard behind me, turning then and peering through the bars and into the swirling darkness below. I strained hard to see or hear anything, and after a few moments, the sound of slow and wet breathing drifted up from that Stygian abyss. I thought I heard, though I can't swear to it, the faint metallic sounds of heavy chains striking the stony floor somewhere in the shadowed depths. And that nausea returned, almost physically pushing me away from the door and chasing me back up through the levels of the lighthouse above. I didn't stop until I found myself in the lamp room at the top of the lighthouse, dropping heavily into the chair and resting my head on the table, trying to catch my breath. It took me longer than it should have to realize that the room was quiet, other than the muted sounds of the wind and the sea. The beacon was no longer rotating behind its lenses. The light was no longer lit. It felt for all the world like something momentous had just changed. The hell is going on? September 3rd, 6:45 p.m. They're not coming. They're not answering my radio calls anymore. I know they're still there, listening, but they won't answer me. Won't tell me why. I've been trying to raise anyone, on the radio for hours with no answer. I'd just about given up trying when my radio crackled and the voice of Calvin Sykes, the man who was supposed to be my new partner, came through. His tone was flat, but I didn't miss the hint of frustration in it. Maybe a little disappointment, too. He said that the light had gone out, like that meant something special I didn't understand. He told me that I'd been warned to stay out of the lower levels. Didn't ask me if I'd disobeyed his instructions. Somehow he just knew. Said that I was a part of it now. That there wasn't anything they could do. They had no choice. Nothing could come off the island now. Something about forsaken and the nameless, but he'd lost me by that point. I have no earthly idea what he was rambling about, but I understood the gist of what he was telling me. They weren't coming. Then he asked if I was a religious man. I told him I wasn't, and he didn't say anything for a long time. When he spoke again, it was only a couple of words filtering through the static. "I'm sorry." That's it. That's all he said, and that's the last time I heard his or anyone else's voice over the radio. I don't know what's going on, what it is that I'm supposed to be a part of. I just know that I'm all alone out here, with no way off this damn island. The sun is starting to go down now, and the storm is getting worse than I've seen since I've been here. The sky has a strange green tint to it, and the wind is starting to sound like voices swirling around outside. I just want to go home, but I don't think that's going to happen. I just heard the sound of those hinges again from downstairs.